This is I Know You Will. I'm hoping the de-esser, yes, that's better. I Know You Will. And we are starting in get closer. 1, 2, 3. I'd never have allowed myself to internally explode in a huge crowd before the Lana Del Rey show in Tampa, but it might have been time. Lana Del Rey isn't necessarily my favorite artist, so I wasn't sure what I was doing on StubHub over a month ago, buying a now vastly overpriced ticket to her Tampa show. When I found my Live Nation notification emails submerged in my spam folder during a weird realization that I was missing invites, that was the one that hit me the hardest. Shit, I thought, I can't miss this one. I don't know why, and to say I did would be to project a retrospective speculation about attraction in some unconscious fashion where I knew I needed to cry, nay, sob, for the release. It's safe to say, however, that reluctantly moving back to my hometown of Daytona Beach was part of the push, especially as I overwork my memoir podcast of my young life here to the point where everyone wants this sweet release of hearing less of me talk about it and hearing more of the actual podcast. Or any of it, really. So around 3 p.m. on 9/25/2023, I got in my car to make the trek to MIDFlorida Amphitheater, knowing full well it was going to be a mess, gauging the demand based on the speed of selling out. I figured I paid way too much to miss it, so I did my usual thing of listening to playlists in the car. I didn't even listen to Del Rey. It's weird. I arrived at gates and found that I was correct. Not only was it swamped with people, it felt more like a swamp than any other show I've been to this year. And I know swamps because I'm from the swamps of Florida. It was hot as hell. You also cannot feel a breeze if there are walls of people around you in that density. The lawn area was more packed than I'd ever seen at that venue. Something felt a bit charged. It felt a little unsafe to me. It's that on-edge feeling that one surprise and there'd be a stampede with me underfoot. I figured it was probably just me, or the fact that this was so clearly a logistical nightmare in the uneasy undercurrent, so wasn't just me. I suppose I was primed for this experience, and all it took was a spark of recognition to push it forward. I was on edge. What brought me to the edge? I'd been sick for about 4 years with increasing intensity, from insomnia so fierce it made me crazy, to panic disorder, to the deepest loneliness I've ever felt in my life. I was incredibly sick and in an amount of debilitating physical pain in every waking moment. I was no longer a priority to most people, having disappeared into a home where I may as well have been living alone, as my partner was never home between 3 bands, a charity, and whatever else was going on of interest. I was too sick to go anywhere, and I was beginning to cease being self-aware. An empty life with no stimulation will drive you mad. So I always looked forward to family functions with my 4 stepdaughters, their mother, and her partner. We are a 4-parent unit of sorts. But I'd lost myself in all of it somewhere. You don't see that coming. You awaken to it and wonder what the hell happened. I was never codependent before this, ever. And to be fair, I was gone. Time ceased to mean anything that wasn't a Zoom meeting because I was more than exhausted, more than disabled, more than depressed. It was like truly being the living dead. This is what you get when you recreate the trauma of your painful formative years, which was one major breakthrough in the center I stepped into in July of 2022, which I entered because I was suicidal and also not doing this again. I was sick for 4 years of increasing intensity, landing me in a wheelchair in 2021, and this was following more years of struggling with insomnia and panic disorder, as well as an actively creative but self-punishing mind. They're the issues that tell you to change your life, but you really start to believe it's really just the end of being you. So you stop being you and stop expecting people to love you. You stop feeling your own humanity. You stop feeling like you're connected to anything and are just suspended in GAFA. Probably sounds trite. I don't care. And he still left me, though I prefer ditched because it was brutal. Even including someone I'd taken into my home and done my best to support and love. And they'd been carrying on, my understanding is, for maybe a year right under my nose. I was too sick to think it all through. We do shit for our own reasons, and I'm sure they have them, but betrayal is another thing altogether. I had nothing, not a thing, when I walked out of that house in May of 2022. I depended on the kindness of friends before I chose, on a dime, to enter a detox unit, to get off all of my meds, and then to a behavioral center to address everything else. It was a month and a half of treatment and laboring over all of this. It was bold as fuck, and I will never allow anyone to say otherwise. I don't know anyone else electing to go through that process for a month and a half out of their lives. Never, ever forget that I am hardcore on this stuff. Nobody put me there. Tactile hallucinations of a spider climbing up my back, walking around with no meds and a system of depleted GABA, sweating it out in a bed near a stranger, talking to almost no one you love for a month and a half. Sign me up, right? I walked out. When I walked out of the center and got into my bestie's car, she gave me a side glance, and I kind of had to manage my level of energy, but she seemed happy to see me and was patient. Everything looked so green. I'd forgotten that I was out of context for everyone else. But I walked out of the aforementioned residential scenario on a new medication regimen of significantly less medication and no controlled substances. And when I say I walked out, I mean that. I did so with no need for a wheelchair, no need for the intensely specific autoimmune diet I had been on for a couple of years, and a very, very clear message from the incredible staff: don't talk to your ex. I didn't listen. It all seems so hyperbolic. I'm grateful for the loop-de-loo of that experience because it just supported what they'd said. If I hadn't fucked that up and set myself back, I wouldn't have policed my well-being for the rest of this time. I had a composition notebook in my bag, filled with what I felt was the final breakthrough for the story I wanted to tell my entire life. It was time, and I knew at least that I wanted to narrate it myself. About 62 handwritten pages. It's been hard to commit because I only get to tell this once. But literally today, I am recording with the merciless plan of this is it. I moved back to Daytona Beach in October 2022 and accomplished what I felt I could there. I walked my doggo, took photos of the sunrise to feel better about my insomnia, began making silly TikToks and whatnot to have a place to throw the negative energy, reached back down into who I was before that relationship to see what was left, reconnected to my subculture and the people that are part of it. allowed myself to make things mean what they maybe didn't mean outside my head, wrote and let music back into my life in the genres I'd always loved and somehow lost. Internally, it was extraordinary, though much like someone wearing headphones, you can't really witness that from the outside. I found my poetry in there. Black eyeliner, my sexuality, though I'm still living like an anchoress. Beep boop sounds, pop culture nerdistry, nonstop interpretation of everything, a sense of my own fashion that people like better anyway. All those centuries of literature, critical theory attaching to things easily and creatively, and all of those shining orbs floating. And it was beautiful in there because my inner life is rich beyond my own words. Also, I learned later that I see these things because it was a strange understanding of Lacan's objet petit a without the application of the exact concept. Slowly, people noticed the return of things we'd all thought were gone and some things most folks had never seen. And we're back. By that Monday, the drive to all of the shows from Daytona Beach to Orlando and Tampa and Jacksonville was a well-cut path, though I found myself extra tired that day. I said to myself, "Get in the car, loser. We're going musicking." I got there and it was a mess. I managed by just grabbing a drink and going to my seat where there was a super cute couple in the 2 seats toward the end. They smiled, and I felt instantly comfortable, which says a lot, because people terrify me right now. I talk to almost no new people, and I stay removed even in public. I imagine I don't need to explain why at this point. But the young man, we'll call him John, turned to me and asked if I'd seen the merch line, and I said it was awful. After a little bit, John boldly turned to me and asked which album made me buy the ticket. I started a bit because it hit me that I don't listen to her that way. I put her on shuffle and just drive or lay in my room to the vaguely held notion that'll produce the tears I need. I fessed up and told them. They looked at each other and I thought they'd be annoyed. But instead, the woman, we'll call her Janet, cracked a smile and asked what the result of that was. And I said, no more a bumpy ride than any other way to listen to her. She nodded. I continued, I feel like sometimes when I shuffle an artist and hear the songs out of context, that it allows me to interpret just that one song. The door was open to conversation with them instantly. When they stepped away to go get a t-shirt, I looked at my phone and Mama Kay had texted me to say the younger of them, S, was at the show. I was excited because I wanted to see my baby, but she wasn't there yet and the show seemed like it was already a late starter. If I'd gotten up to go get a t-shirt, maybe things wouldn't have been the same for the rest of the night. Just the knowledge that S was there added a layer of meaning because we'd be watching the same thing together in that crowd. I hadn't thought of that possibility because I really do spend that much time alone in my personal little journey. So much time, in fact, that I forget I live in anyone's head at all. But knowing S was there created a little flutter in my chest, a warm feeling. I lifted my head and began to do the usual crowd analysis. But this time it had a different valence because I thought about how this is the girls' generation and S is the youngest. John and Janet. They are significantly younger than I am, wherever they are, but this allowed me to explain a few things about the way I see Del Rey's work. I mentioned the Daytona connection, and they talked about the whole drugs at the beach thing in her music, and I said, well, that's Daytona. They sat back down as though the only reason they'd left was so I'd look at my phone. John returned to attempting to ferret out what about Del Rey's work I loved and said there is surely a favorite album. And I thought for a second and said, actually, that's an evil question, and laughed because there are so many for starters. But there isn't any one album. I guess I just listen and let my hair down, so to speak. John and Janet actually took well to that idea. I have to just trust myself well enough that if people disapprove, it wasn't because I lied. They looked at each other, and Janet's face started to look curiously pleased. I figured I was already in it, so I continued, saying it's more like her songs are moments for me, and the current context of that song in my head is all that matters, and thinking about it, it means that it does wreck the themes. I guess I'm just more about the feels, so I just put her on shuffle. Now I was sounding like a barbarian. It's true, though, and they said, yeah, that makes sense. John began chatting about how Del Rey was getting more mature and that they both looked forward to when she can sing about things other than romantic relationships. But John continued that he meant through the lens of romantic relationships. I said, but lots of artists take that road and emerge later. I remember those earlier days of Tori Amos. She was always political, but it wasn't as overt until later. John said most folks say honeymoon, though I said American love stories are usually working through something entirely separate, through the metaphors, and they nodded in that, way. Still more overt, we both agreed, and I said too, well, expect it. I began again. Look at Tori Amos. This crowd feels so familiar because it feels so charged with the energy of reckoning with the self. And women in my generation had Tori Amos to break the ice about sex and men and sexuality and issues like rape. They knew Amos existed, but hadn't given her much of a listen. I would, because this energy is, of course, different. I'm Gen X, and it's a different generation. But I wonder how much freer young women here at the show feel than I did in the 90s. I'd like to say a lot, but what are the odds? John looked a little struck. It hit me that I'm 48, and they are not. So I explained a bit about Amos's work and how she crossed over into more overt politics, and then we ended up talking about other artists. I don't remember how Grimes came up, but they said they'd seen her at a small gig a while back, and now she's been with the most infamous billionaire on the planet. I told them I'd do them one better and told them I saw her open for Astra at Back Booth in 2011. John's face lit up. Holy shit, I love Back Booth. Janet was like, oh my God, that place is small. John started telling a Back Booth story about his birthday, and we laughed because I also had a rather notorious 35th birthday event at Back Booth. Concerts are history. I don't have to argue that point, and you never can tell how significant any moment will be. I told them about Lollapalooza 1 and how it was my first real experience with shows, and that was trial by fire, but also the reason I was able to stay so passionate about music. I told them about how that day I saw Susie and the Banshees, Henry Rollins, Jane's Addiction, and then I said there was a new guy whose first album had just taken off a year or so before, named Trent Reznor. Stunned silence. I began thinking about my own history in that moment, thinking about 30 years of the past, the music and my life as the feelings moved through me, and I did my best to contain them. I remembered being 15 at the show, and we lied to our parents to go, and thank God we did. I remember how I became so anxious that shows were near impossible for me in later years, though I was able to see Peter Murphy solo and in Bauhaus, Sisters of Mercy, again, Tori Amos like 5 times, Lilith Fair, Amy Mann, They Might Be Giants, and obviously more, but that was all before 2002. Go to the show, kids. Dig as far down as you can for the money. John said he'd never have known I'm 48, and I said something about being sneaky like that. He wanted to know more about my concert history after Nikki Lane left the stage. It's a garbled mess after that. But I was talking about my own history through the artists and albums, all of the shows and who I'd seen and how they were all history. I remembered how boomers telling tales of their own concerts had us saying the same. All of that history, all of my history, and the ways we lived it through our own music was full tilt swimming in my inner narration, and I said, some of these young women might as well be my friends and I. Have you heard Scarlet's Walk? It feels like that album tonight, like a devastating historical moment just took place, and she sings about American imperialism and indigenous struggle, the boredom in relationships, homophobia and hate, war, 9/11. But all of that set a strange perspective shift, and it was uncomfortable. I stood up to stretch, but it was really to stand up and look at the packed amphitheater of at least 70% young women. Side note, I have a tendency to evade. Oh boy, I thought. Oh boy, this is feeling edgy, a bit frightening, a bit unstable. Were we this way? Absolutely, we scared the fuck out of boomers with that shit. That is my generation. Flower dresses and docks and sex and rage. And then I wondered what I'd say to my younger self if she was there, and it hit me. S was there. And I began to feel that urgency was outside of me, and I wanted to hold them and whisper to hang on to themselves. How could I stop them when I couldn't be stopped? This is some weird catcher in the rye thinking, but fuck it. Can I stop them before they go over? No, all I would ever be able to do is hold them if they did. I felt a clock start ticking inside me. I quickly checked to see how old Lana Del Rey was that night. 38? A good age for that kind of pivot, I noted. The death before the death. By the time Del Rey took the stage, the 3 of us were already inspired by our conversation, and I turned to watch with a now heightened sense about what was happening around me, while I could see everyone else's eyes were glued to Del Rey, as they should be. The crowd at the amphitheater lost their minds when she came out, and there was barely even a beat before the place lit up with every person singing the lyrics. It was rise, then falling into the music. I have this recorded. Those are often my favorite moments now, where the air is thick with the emotions and everyone stands at a different place in their history and reasons for being there, but we're all there. Are we together? Am I set apart as always? And I started to just feel a little choked up, so when she started singing Young and Beautiful, I was a bit emotional already, but then in the middle of recording a video, she came back around to the lines, and it hit me. Will you still love me when I'm no longer young and beautiful? Oh no, I thought. Oh no, so many young women here. And I felt like I wanted a door to my own past to escape and warn my younger self about where life was headed. Cute, little blonde me, thinking she's hiding those demons, already too exhausted to think anything other than I'd be dead by 48. I'm still shocked I'm not dead yet, even by my own hand. Will you still love me when I got nothing but my aching soul? I'm looking around, and some are singing like they're happy, some inspired, and some seemed to understand what I was beginning to realize, and then, I know you will. And that's when a sharp pain in my chest hit me, like a dagger was cutting off a piece of life, and I audibly gasped and put my hand on my chest. Tears decided they were done waiting. I know you will. I was thinking, why does this hurt so much? Why now? I'd heard the song so many times, like most people, and I'd heard it as increasingly ironic. This is excruciating. Will they see me sobbing? No, they're all standing, and some other young women are starting to lose their shit. Is that fear? Why do I feel this now? I cut the video off and leaned forward for a moment. John asked if I was okay, and I lied. Will you still love me when I'm no longer young and beautiful? But why now? When was the last time I listened to the song? Why now? My inner narrator said, because it wasn't there before, my love. And then it was like I pushed the dagger in deeper myself, on my own, because we are not doing this again, self. Oh, that's me. I'm her. She's me. I wasn't loved. I was left. I was left for a younger woman, a thing I couldn't have identified with prior. I was left for being too much. She was 28 when she walked into our door, and I am no longer young and beautiful. And I was sick. I gave all of myself to the person I thought I should, even if it wasn't what I wanted most of the time. 12 years later, I'm standing here as a fraction of who I was before. And here I am, a broken middle-aged woman who's no longer beautiful and no longer desirable. Here is where the beautiful come to die. Here is where the beautiful come to die. I didn't die, but I did die. I almost died, but I did die, didn't I? My beauty died, and I died, and who everyone thought I was died. And what part of me is even still alive? Is this the death before the death? The center of my brain. My brain decided it was done with holding back its true neurogoblin self, and I flashed to the day I entered the center, and it was like I said, roll tape, and I was sitting next to myself in some weird imagined scenario where I'm crying, but I'm also comforting myself. I've come there to die. I've come there instead of dying, but I am also there to retrieve me. And then Del Rey said at some point, give me some piano. And I felt weirdly startled that it wasn't Tori singing, or then that it wasn't a Tori Amos cover. I could have sworn she was heading into a cover of something from Tori Amos's Scarlet's Walk. This is how our experiences are layered in our own history. I cemented the observation that was Tori Amos's moment of inhabiting her full political self with at least less about difficult romantic relationships, or at least something more overtly political. We had just experienced 9/11, and the curtains had fallen on so many things we thought we knew, even for me as an early Americanist trying to pull back that curtain. It was a struggle for the 2 years I taught following that semester, so by the time Scarlett's Walk reached us, we were already raw. We were already talking about the issues we couldn't possibly have avoided. I was 26 when the Twin Towers struck, and I was a week into my first semester teaching with almost no training and definitely no education on trauma. Should we have been teaching that semester? Should they have ripped me out of there by my collar? The singing in unison was most of the remaining show, and I kept thinking about us and my younger self, and about all of my friends, how we were and how we are, and how it felt like I was going back and forth in a wormhole. Me, us, me in the center, me with the girls as children, me with the girls coloring eggs, the girls trying on my kicky boots and squeeing over my corsets that night, me driving Q around, and then some of my most vulnerable students. I remember when we sang in unison at a Tori Amos show, and here we are, standing, following the staggering amount of death and destruction and fear. I remembered the show for Scarlett's Walk and how I sobbed, letting it all out like it was sanctioned. And here I was, losing my shit while I watched the faces of those who felt the irony and those who didn't, yet know to feel any. Some women singing unhinged, and some blissfully peaceful, the knowing and the unknowing. Here we are, standing after 3 years of unfathomable worldwide death, political divisions, and a collective howl while we all pile into the next show, because this is the year for music, my friends, because we all need to heal. We are all surviving something, even if it's a loss of our relationships or family ties or ways we see America. I was suicidal when I made the mad number of phone calls to start the detox to behavioral center journey I mentioned. Dangerously so, even though it was the 4th time since that relationship started 13 years ago. But I'd had suicidal ideation in several moments as young as 13, and I remember it if nobody else does. My memoir is telling the events about how I got there to the suicidal ideation, how I got there in the first place, and here I am at 48, still struggling with the escapism of it, still holding on for reasons I've shared very few times, because nobody owes me anything for staying alive, even if they're grateful. Sometimes. Fully sobbing and just trying to take video and photo to document all of this happening that you cannot document. And I knew I wasn't healing any more than I had already done in Daytona, and it was like a giant plateau. It's time to go, I thought. You cannot hold onto sand. At show's end. Just before the show ended, I leaned in to say goodbye to John, and he hugged me. I stepped to Janet and I whispered, "Remember what I said about Tori, Scarlett's Walk, beginning to end." I knew the irony. And she looked pleased, but perhaps confused. And I said, "The day I know you will," reaches full irony, and it slices. "Maybe you'll remember this conversation." And she looked weirdly inspired, scared. I don't know, but also, I think she understood what I was getting at. I had to leave to go find S. When I saw her, I threw my arms around her, but we were caught in the worst after-show scene I have ever seen. Nobody could get out, and then nobody could leave. Even once we tried to get into our cars to complain about how short it was, how Del Rey simply can't continue to play at these small venues because you either cannot get tickets because they sell out so fast, then you can't park, you can't leave, you can't get merch. There was a collective ugh. I was talking about some of my observations around Del Rey's work, and S's friend was sharing that she liked hearing me talk about music that way. A lot of people say they like hearing me talk. There is great irony in this. This started in the center, this idea that people like to hear me talk. And this was something that the other residents would continually ask me to do. I didn't know until toward the end of my stay there, that all of the questions they were asking were really just so they could hear me talk. It's not that they weren't interested, but it was about hearing me talk. And I thought about how in my previous life, the idea that I should shut up was loud to me. So, from the back seat, S popped up with something that quietly broke my heart as we sat, trying to get out of there. The longer we sat, the longer we had occasion to chat about random things and then painful things. When I dropped S at her hotel, we were having an important little conversation. And when we had to break, I threw my arms around her, and inside, I could hear my inner narrator say, "I love you like words fail, and I will scrape anyone who touches a hair on your head across the bottom of the ocean." And how I wished I could hold back all the pain for all my girls, and for all girls. Driving home, I got in the car and I felt completely wrecked. I drove until out of sight and then stopped to sob uncontrollably some more. And it was a moment where I wasn't behaving like everyone can see me, and I was letting myself do the ugly cry because a factor in my life was that I always acted as if someone was watching and judging me. And there was, but it hadn't occurred to me that it was me. I was exhausted at this point. I was thirsty. I was ready to go home. I put on Scarlett's Walk. Made sense. And started the 2.5-hour drive back to Daytona Beach, singing every single song twice and some 6 times or more. I realized the worst thing another Truman Show could be is boring. So if anyone is watching, fine. Here are all of my worst notes. Here are all of my worst notes. But instead, I felt parts of my throat relax. I could feel the vibration in ways I had forgotten. Those pleasant ways when something is truly moving through and not by the will of it. And I let myself just sing. I sang pancake about 8 times or more because every time I felt like there was more and more and more. I leapt from growl to soprano operatics and allowed myself to move as best I could in my seat to it. I started hearing little beep, boop, beep sounds that I wanted to make on a little special thing I got myself, thinking of cover ideas. No, there's no singles coming forward. I had only stopped crying to talk to S and her friend. Can't very well stand there crying. But all the way home, I sang through every chest pain, every loss of vocal control, just remembering a time in my life where we were ready to move beyond old metaphors. High notes, low notes, worst notes, best notes, high notes. Will I love myself as fiercely as that? I know I will. Someday, I know I will. It was a revelation. Here was my voice, and it's been there silent all these years. I was elated to feel how much easier it was to sing, even if I'd been crying so hard. But I figured if this was a Truman scenario, maybe my people were like, "Yes, queen," and not whispering to each other how much I suck. By the time I got home, I was wrecked even more. And even my throat was a bit raw from breaking every goddamn vocal rule I could. I got home and haven't completely stopped crying since that moment at the show, even when I feel peaceful or like I'm happy. Something that needed to break exploded, but it wasn't all of me. I am still here. I knew it was time to leave Florida, not just Daytona. That state doesn't serve me anymore, and I feel so detached anyway. Why do I continue living here? It's too expensive in Orlando, and it's too expensive emotionally to live in Daytona. So I'll get the fuck out. I made the plan. I arrived at my dad's and took a photo of the moon. Then I wondered, how old was Tori Amos when Scarlet's Walk was released? I quickly Googled. 39. She was 39.